I knew something was off when my server logs registered a warning at 4:22 in the morning. It was a time when only three kinds of people reached out to a man like me: dying relatives, drunk acquaintances, or mainframe servers gasping their last breath. This time, it was the third. There was no loud ringtone, just a low-level ping nested deep within the system logs, like a soft whisper from a digital basement. I rolled over, noted the timestamp in the notebook on my nightstand, and went back to sleep. I was not panicked and I was not surprised. I was simply documenting the heartbeat of a system that had been keeping this corporation alive for decades. It was still there, pulsing in the dark. The next morning I arrived at the office early, carrying my usual travel mug of bitter coffee. Nobody looked up when I walked past the cubicles. They never did. I was Daniel Vance, the resident systems administrator, a quiet ghost in the IT department. People only remembered my existence when a printer jammed, but when the annual bonus season arrived, I was invisible. That arrangement suited me perfectly. I had been at Aero Systems for 26 years. My universe was composed of server racks, legacy scripts, and databases so ancient they still communicated in Perl. Deep within the network, buried under 3 decades of migrations and behind a firewall that everyone else had forgotten, sat a little disaster recovery protocol. I had written it myself in the late 90s, during the early dot-com expansion. The protocol was simple but critical. It relied on a silent voltage signal that pulsed out every 6 hours from one very specific physical desk phone, mine. It was a quiet security measure from an era before cloud computing became the standard, a time when off-site backups meant a secure room with concrete walls and backup generators in a different state. The signal had no label in the repository, no descriptive documentation, just a single comment in the source code. Do not remove this script unless you know what it does. Every 360 minutes, the desk phone sent a handshake to the backup database cluster. If that pulse ever stopped, nothing dramatic would happen immediately. There would be no sirens. Instead, the system would quietly begin an escalation process, slowly and methodically. It would first notify the backup monitoring nodes. Then, it would ping the secondary shell servers. If those queries went unanswered for 5 days, the system would initiate a total failover protocol, redirecting all operational databases to the secure disaster recovery site and locking the primary servers until a physical hardware key was inserted. The only reason this system had survived for so long was that nobody ever touched my desk phone. The phone was a beige, heavy relic from the 90s, complete with a coiled cord that smelled faintly of dust. I had pasted a yellow sticky note on the base that read, "Do not unplug." That simple note was enough to keep everyone away. The new hires in the IT department had no idea what it did. Most of them believed that the command line interface was a legacy streaming service. But I knew, and I checked the connection status every morning. We are the quiet safety net between a standard workday and total operational collapse. But the corporate culture at Aero Systems was shifting. The older executives, the ones who remembered how I had saved the company during the database crash of 2009, were retiring. They were being replaced by younger managers who wore expensive sport jackets and loved using corporate buzzwords. They renamed our IT support department to Enablement, which really meant cutting our operating budget while expecting us to keep everything running without complaints. I ignored the corporate politics and kept my head down, verifying that the signal pulsed out every 6 hours. Then, Julian Brody arrived. Julian was hired as our new digital transformation director, and he brought a cloud of self-importance with him. He was tall, thin, and had a sharp jawline that looked like it had been designed for a corporate slide presentation. He spoke in a loud, aggressive tone, but his handshake was surprisingly limp. He walked into our department and announced that we should all call him Julian because titles build unnecessary walls. He was the type of manager whose online profile description was disruptor and strategic visionary. His very first action was to schedule a mandatory team meeting at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. He offered us cheap donuts and bad coffee. I sat in the back row of the conference room, my notebook open but my pen still capped. I had witnessed this exact routine 5 times before during my tenure. I had survived the year 2000 scare, the transition to centralized servers, and the time a previous executive decided to run our entire database through an unverified external program because he thought it was modern. Julian was different. He spoke with the passion of an evangelist. He clicked through a presentation until he reached a slide titled Our Efficiency Mandate. The slide listed 4 main goals: reduce friction, modernize tools, automate legacy structures, and reevaluate long-tenured redundancies. The room went silent. Everyone knew that reevaluating long-tenured redundancies was just a polite way of saying they wanted to fire the veterans who earned higher salaries. Julian looked directly at me when he said it. I did not blink. I simply raised my coffee mug. He smiled back, but there was no warmth in his eyes. I knew then that trouble was coming. By the following Thursday, Julian had already begun his purge. He deleted several shared network drives and terminated a background process that was quietly rotating our system log archives. When one of my junior technicians, Timothy, asked why the process was gone, Julian replied that the script was outdated and had no active data, which was corporate speak. For I did not recognize it, so I deleted it. I confronted him in the hallway later, keeping my voice calm and professional. I explained that the script he had just deleted was the only thing preventing our database archives from overflowing and crashing the compliance server. I warned him specifically that our company had legal obligations. Under Title 18, United States Code, Section 1519, deleting or failing to maintain these compliance records was a federal offense, especially since we held contracts with government entities. Deleting those logs could expose the company and its officers to severe penalties during an audit. Julian simply shrugged, adjusted his headset, and said that it was a process problem that we would fix in a future development sprint. I asked him if he had even checked what the script did before removing it. He smiled, told me that if it were truly important, it would have been documented in the modern database, and walked away. I had written that script myself on a Saturday afternoon back in the year 2006, when the previous chief technology officer called me in a panic because we were running out of database storage space. I remember that call clearly, sitting at my kitchen table while my family prepared dinner, listening to the desperate voice of a man who was usually so confident. I remember the loud music and laughter in the background of that call as he was attending his son's bar mitzvah, begging me to save the system from crashing before the board meeting on Monday. The code had survived 6 different department heads, 3 chief financial officers, and multiple corporate restructuring efforts. Now it was gone because a new manager wanted to look proactive to his superiors. That was when I felt a familiar sensation in my chest. It was not anger, but a cold realization that Julian was too reckless to be stopped by reason. He had just stepped over a line he did not even see. The final straw came a week later. Julian decided to conduct a physical floor audit, which in practice meant walking through the office with a large plastic bin to throw away anything he deemed obsolete. He strolled through the department with a clipboard, looking like he was auditioning for a role as a corporate liquidator. Behind him walked Bradley from procurement, pushing a giant gray recycling bin. I watched them throw away functional monitors, older keyboards, and personal items. Other employees watched in silent terror, afraid that their desks would be targeted next. One senior programmer actually lost his specialized ergonomic footrest and filed for immediate stress leave after a heated argument with Julian. I did not move. I kept typing, monitoring my system logs and backup thresholds. When they reached my cubicle, Julian leaned over my screen, his voice dripping with condescension. He pointed at the desk phone and asked if I was aware that we were not operating a museum. He remarked that landlines were an ancient relic and laughed. I kept my eyes on my monitor and told him that the phone served a specific technical purpose. He replied that he was sure it did, reached down and before I could stop him, yanked the cord from the wall outlet. The plastic connector clicked loose and the faint hum in the receiver died. He threw the beige phone into the recycling bin, where it clattered against some old metal monitor arms and a dusty surge protector. I sat there, frozen. It was not just a phone. It was the physical anchor of our disaster recovery protocol. The network would now register a total loss of the handshake signal. The script would assume the primary data center had been compromised or destroyed. It would wait exactly 120 hours, letting the secondary backups verify the failure, before locking down the primary servers and initiating a full failover to our secondary site. That secondary site was located in a secure facility in Pennsylvania, and the only way to reverse the failover was with a physical hardware token that I kept in a safe at my home. Julian had no idea what he had done. Nothing about this safety system was written in the public documentation portals. I had kept it offline on purpose, because you do not document an emergency switch where an untrained manager can click it, and you do not store your ultimate safety net in the cloud when the entire purpose of the system is to survive a cloud failure. I sat back in my chair and logged into the system through a specialized administrator terminal that only I could access. I closely monitored the connection logs. The scheduled handshake had been missed at 11:43 on that Thursday morning. The countdown had begun. Script 1 was already executing. Script 2 was queued. Script 3 was scheduled to trigger in 120 hours. I did not say a word. I did not argue with Julian. I simply gathered my personal belongings, placed them in my bag, and walked toward the elevator. Behind me, I heard Julian laughing, asking the other employees if they had ever seen someone so attached to a piece of plastic. Nobody replied. They did not know the significance of what had just happened, but I did. Julian had pulled the thread that would unravel the entire corporate network. I drove home in a state of absolute calm. I had spent over 2 decades protecting this company from its own bad decisions. Now, I was going to let gravity do the work. I did not return to the office for the rest of that day. The next morning, I arrived at exactly 6:15, before anyone else was awake. The security guard did not look up from his phone, simply waving me through the gate. I walked to my desk, connected my hardware key to the network, and did something I had never done in 26 years. I downloaded my personal exit archives, containing my custom tools, configuration files, and scripts onto an encrypted drive. I wore the drive on a lanyard around my neck, hidden beneath a badge that read CatDad Database King. I wiped my work laptop completely clean. I did not leave a dramatic note or a message of warning. I simply wrote a short sentence on a yellow sticky note. System retired. Ask the cloud. I placed it on the empty monitor, gathered my things, including my notebook and a half-dead office plant, and walked out of the building. The exit scanner beeped behind me as I stepped into the morning air. I got into my car and drove 35 miles out of the city, toward the rural county roads where I owned a small storage unit. I entered my code at the gate of the facility, and the metal door of my unit creaked open. The padlock was a heavy brass model that had rusted over the seasons, requiring a strong twist of my hand to open. Inside was my quiet sanctuary of technical backup. There were stacks of bankers' boxes, rows of obsolete server components, and plastic tubs filled with cables. In the corner sat 2 servers I had saved from decommission years ago, still humming quietly on a backup power supply and connected to a dedicated internet line I paid for out of my own pocket. I stood in the dusty room, feeling a sense of deep relief. The smell of old cardboard and copper wire reminded me of my early days in technology, back when systems were solid and physical. The storage unit was filled with shelves of old manuals, reference guides for operating systems like Unix and Solaris, and notebooks detailing every minor network outage we had faced. I kept records of every major system configuration change since the late 90s, long before modern ticket management systems were invented. I sat in an old office chair, opened a notebook from several years ago, and reviewed the diagrams of the dead man's switch. I could have stopped the countdown with a single command from this terminal, but I chose to do nothing. I simply closed the notebook and drove to my cabin in the woods, 110 miles away, where the cellular signal was weak and the air was cold. On Friday morning, the warnings began to appear. In the company chat system, Julian posted a message telling everyone to ignore the backup failure alerts, calling them a known issue that would be fixed during the modernization process. He shared an image of a pie chart, indicating system health was at 82%, as if a colorful graphic could replace actual network stability. But behind the scenes, the foundation was already crumbling. The automatic backup validation script failed to complete. A major database mismatch occurred on the eastern server node. Julian closed the technician's ticket within 15 minutes, marking it as a redundant system alert. I was no longer there to save them. Actually, I was sitting on the porch of my cabin, listening to the wind in the trees, but the system still communicated with me. Years ago, I had configured the dead man's switch to send encrypted status updates to my private server if the primary connection failed. My terminal pulsed in the quiet room, its green text glowing against the dark screen. The first alert indicated a database replication mismatch. The second showed a file synchronization failure on 4 separate nodes. The system played a small sound file through my e-speakers, the sound of my old cat Winston meowing. I noted the timestamps in my journal, drank my tea, and watched the digital decay progress. Back at the headquarters, the situation was becoming chaotic. Timothy, the junior technician who had questioned the deletion of the log rotation script, submitted his resignation and left the building by noon. His log showed that he had tried to close 5 critical alerts, all of which had been marked by Julian as user error. In response to the growing network lag, Julian posted a humorous image in the company chat, mocking the staff for being afraid of change. Within the next 4 days, 2 more experienced engineers resigned without waiting for their final paychecks. They were tired of fighting fires caused by their own manager's ignorance. The remaining staff were forced to run from one emergency to another, trying to fix systems they did not understand. The email servers began to display sync delays. The customer portal slowed down significantly. An administrative assistant submitted an urgent ticket because the employee system showed her tenure as 0 months, despite her 20 years of service to the company. The support desk forwarded the issue to Julian, who replied that it was likely a temporary database sync delay and suggested restarting the application. I saw the logs from my cabin. The network was not failing because of old code. It was failing because the people running it did not respect the architecture that kept it alive. The final collapse occurred on a Monday morning. Mondays in our industry are reserved for disasters disguised as progress. Julian had bragged during the team meeting about hiring an offshore development team to rewrite our entire back-end database structure. He called it modernizing the core system and removing the legacy overhead. The update was pushed to the production servers at 3:12 in the morning. By 7:46, the help desk was flooded with phone calls from angry employees. By 8:05, the payroll system had locked up completely. Employees logged in to find their payment history wiped clean, showing 0 balances or negative numbers. For some individuals, the system indicated they owed the company money. The client portal failed next. Customer logins were rejected, and when they did succeed, the interface displayed random data. One client called in a rage, claiming their database dashboard was displaying someone's private family photos. The support staff were overwhelmed, unable to answer the volume of incoming calls from screaming customers demanding to know why their sensitive data was exposed. Then, the human resources database vanished. Files, performance reviews, and onboarding documents were gone. Employee identification numbers were set to null, and anyone who attempted to log in was flagged by the system as deceased. Because the system marked them as deceased and set their database records to null, the automated payroll system triggered a termination sequence for over 80 employees. This sudden mass lockout of staff without notice technically triggered a violation of the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, the Warnin Act, codified at Title 29, United States Code, Section 2101, which requires a 60-day advance notice for mass layoffs. The corporate legal team was in an absolute panic, realizing that Julian's system glitch had just exposed them to class action lawsuits from their own workforce. At my cabin, I sat in front of my terminal, watching the logs unfold. The database synchronization had failed. The secondary disaster recovery site was attempting to spin up, but it was blocked. It was waiting for the hardware security token that sat in my pocket. I watched the system alerts pile up, feeling my hands remain perfectly steady. The network was not crashing. It was following the safety protocols I had written to contain a major security breach. At 1:17 in the afternoon, a new message arrived in my personal inbox from Lawrence Bennett, our Chief Operating Officer. The subject line read, "Urgent system down, please assist." Lawrence wrote that the company was experiencing a critical outage across all core systems and that they had exhausted their internal options. He stated that they believed I was uniquely positioned to help them resolve the issue, and that they were prepared to compensate me generously for my time and expertise. There was no apology in the email. There was no admission that they should not have let Julian delete the safety systems. It was simply the typical corporate panic, wrapped in formal language and desperation. I read the message in the quiet comfort of my cabin, with my cat Winston asleep near my keyboard. The fire was crackling in the hearth, and outside, the rain was falling gently on the trees. I did not feel any satisfaction or anger. I simply read the words, moved my cursor to the close button, and shut the email tab. I did not reply. Back at the headquarters, Julian was losing his mind. He was pacing between the conference room and the server room, shouting corporate buzzwords at anyone who would listen. He was clutching his expensive laptop like a lifeline, his face red and sweat dripping from his forehead. He was drawing useless flowcharts on the whiteboard, trying to explain that the problem was caused by external factors rather than his own modifications. He claimed that the outage was a domain name system error, a bad update from the vendor, or a zero-day security vulnerability. At one point, he screamed that the collapse was not his fault because nobody had informed him that we had a secondary database cluster in Pennsylvania. One of the technicians had to tell him that he had been warned multiple times, but had chosen to ignore the documentation. Meanwhile, Lawrence ordered the finance department to prepare a blank check for my services. The legal team began drafting a consulting agreement that would pay me triple my previous rate. The chief financial officer asked if they should send flowers to my home, and the human resources team began searching through my departure files to locate my personal phone number. They found nothing. The only contact information they could locate was a single comment left in the database initialization code. This system is maintained by Daniel Vance. If you are reading this comment, something has gone very wrong. No one could explain why that script had been deleted 3 weeks prior, but they did not need to ask. They all knew Julian had authorized the deletion during his purge. They were beginning to realize that the legacy systems they had dismissed as obsolete were the only things that had kept their business running. Wednesday morning arrived with a devastating blow for Aero Systems. The industry news feed carried a prominent headline announcing that the firm had lost its federal contract with the Department of Health Services due to a massive system failure and data compliance breach. The Securities and Exchange Commission was already preparing a formal audit. The client was not just any customer. They represented our largest contract, worth millions of dollars annually. It was canceled with a brief, 2-sentence notification citing irreparable damage to their trust. The company shares plummeted in early trading, and investors began demanding immediate explanations. By noon, the company had brought in an external forensic audit team. They were a quiet group of specialists with tired eyes and clipboards, led by a woman named Clara Rollins. They were not there to restore the network. They were there to perform the technical autopsy. Clara sat in our main conference room for hours, analyzing our code repositories, backup histories, and database logs. Her team quickly uncovered a cold storage branch labeled Disaster Recovery Failover Tree. Inside that folder, they found a markdown documentation file that warned against removing the heartbeat scripts. They also found the delete command that had been executed 18 days prior. At 5:22 in the afternoon, the associated user commit message read, "Obsolete junk purging." The account credentials used to execute the deletion belonged to Julian. Clara remarked to her colleagues that the documentation was incredibly precise, almost as if the author had anticipated this exact scenario. Clara kept investigating and uncovered another critical trace. During the system migration early Tuesday morning, the backup servers had attempted to spin up, but the execution had been blocked because a key initialization script had failed to run. Someone had renamed the script from inittrigger.sh to inittucker.sh. That single change, a simple dash replaced by an underscore, was enough to break the entire automated failover sequence. Clara highlighted the modification in red, showed it to Lawrence, and stated that the action was either gross incompetence or intentional sabotage. She explained to the executive team that Julian's actions did not just represent poor management. Deleting compliance databases and altering logs violated federal data retention standards, creating a direct breach of fiduciary duty under Delaware corporate law. Furthermore, bypassing security controls to rename system files without validation violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, codified under Title 18, United States Code, Section 130. Julian was no longer just a failing director. He was facing serious federal liabilities. By Wednesday afternoon, Julian was escorted from the building by security. He left with no boxes of belongings and no farewells, clutching his phone and muttering that legacy infrastructure had sabotaged his transformation plans. In the break room, one of the remaining technicians remarked that the legacy system had not sabotaged him. It had simply survived his incompetence. I did not need to read the forensic report to know what they had found. I had been watching the entire collapse from my cabin, tracking the automated logs from my private terminal. On Thursday morning at exactly 6 o'clock, the final phase of my protocol executed automatically. A script I had queued years ago, named Disaster Recovery Closure Dispatch, sent a detailed package to all company directors. The email contained a complete chronology of the system failure. It included screenshots of the deleted compliance scripts, the exact timestamps of the file deletions, and a side-by-side comparison of the script name change. It also contained a spreadsheet documenting every warning Julian had ignored. At the bottom, I attached an encrypted file named Legacy Cost Autopsy. Inside that folder was the original system architecture map, the restoration pathway, and my old, expired credentials. The message was clear. This entire disaster could have been prevented if they had simply respected the systems they inherited. In the executive chat channel, panic erupted. The chief financial officer and the legal counsel realized they were facing massive compliance liabilities. Julian tried to post a response, claiming that the data had been manipulated. But before he could finish typing his message, my old administrator credential, buried deep within a permission group named Dr. Locksmith, executed a final command. Julian's account was terminated, and his profile icon turned gray mid-keystroke. At my cabin, I sat on the porch, looking out over the water. The air was cool, and the morning sun was beginning to break through the pine trees. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling the warm mug in my hands. Beside me, sitting on a wooden table and connected to a custom battery pack, was my old beige desk phone. The coiled cord lay silent. The phone did not ring, but the red indicator light pulsed once. It was the signal, quiet and loyal, sending its handshake out into the network every 6 hours. I had not destroyed the company, and I had not broken their servers. I had simply stepped aside and let their own arrogance take its course. Legacy systems do not fail because they are old. They fail because the people who run them forget why they were built.